After a period of time in which the power of the national government has grown, we begin to see the power shifting back to the states. This process began first perhaps in the 1970s and was really accelerated in the 1990s. The first thing to be considered is the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution, passed as part of the Bill of Rights, provides for, or protects, rather, reserved powers of the states. Up until the 1970s, the Supreme Court really didn't do that much with the 10th Amendment. Beginning in the 1970s and definitely in the 1980s, the Supreme Court, for lack of a better term, rediscovered the 10th Amendment and began to invalidate some actions of the national government as violating the 10th Amendment. That is to say, encroaching upon the reserved powers of the states. One of the, or the term that we're going to have for this transference of power back to the states is devolution, or as it was originally called in the 1970s, New Federalism. Devolution, in a fiscal sense, takes the form of taking categorical grants. If you'll recall, those are grants that are very specific in nature, and then packaging them together into block grants, which are general in nature. This tends to give states and local government more discretion, although the trade-off is that these governments typically received less money in a block grant than they would have in the corresponding categorical grants. Perhaps the most significant case in terms of devolution is going to be United States versus Lopez, the decision rendered in 1995. This was where the U.S. Supreme Court will invalidate the Guns-Free School Zone Act of 1990. Under the Guns-Free School Zone Act of 1990, the United States Congress passed a law, or the United States Congress prohibits individuals from bringing guns within 1,000 feet of a school. An individual is accused of violating this, prosecuted for it. Long story short, it goes to the Supreme Court. An important question to ask is going to be, does the Congress of the United States have that authority? If you'll recall from both the Constitution lecture and material that we talked about earlier on this lecture series of Federalism, the government of the United States only has those powers that has been specifically granted. So while most people would agree that perhaps people ought not be bringing guns to school, does the national government have the authority to tell people not to bring guns to school? Where in the delegated powers of the national government does it have this authority? The United States government claimed that it had the authority to do so under the Commerce Clause. From the period of the 1930s up until the 1990s, the Commerce Clause gets used as a mechanism to allow the national government to make policy in a wide variety of areas. The national government will argue that anything that even indirectly relates to interstate commerce will fall under the Commerce Clause. The reasoning behind the national government's assertion is that education has an impact on commerce, and therefore the national government has a right under the Commerce Clause to prohibit people from interfering in a person's acquisition of education. The U.S. Supreme Court basically said, no, you've gone too far. And the significance of this case is it's the first time the Supreme Court disallowed the United States government claiming a power under the Commerce Clause from the 1930s. So from the 1930s to the 1990s, Commerce Clause becomes a way in which power of the national government will grow exponentially. In the 1990s, the U.S. Supreme Court begins to put limits on that. The Guns-Free Schools Law being declared unconstitutional does provide also an illustration of fiscal federalism. So while the national government cannot directly tell someone you can't bring a gun to school, the national government can require states to pass this policy. The way that they can require states to pass the policy is by tying it to some sort of grant. So since there's no group of citizens that are clamoring for the ability to bring guns to school, it was pretty easy for most states to pass legislation that prohibited the same basic type of behavior that was made illegal under the Guns-Free School Zone Act. A similar case is going to be U.S. versus Morrison in 2000. Congress had passed the Violence Against Women Act in an effort to stem the tide of domestic violence. And it allows victims of domestic violence to sue in federal court. Congress claimed the authority to do that under the Commerce Clause, citing the fact that domestic violence can contribute to lost work days, lost productivity, and can contribute to a decline in overall economic activity in the United States. The U.S. Supreme Court said no. Nowhere in the national government's power does it have the authority to move into this area. And again, it's not a case of whether it's a good idea or not. The question is, can the national government do it? I don't know of anybody that is supporting the domestic violence. However, the national government doesn't have the authority to allow people to sue for it. States obviously do. Now we're going to talk about vertical federalism. If you recall, horizontal federalism is about the relative power of the national government in comparison to the states. Vertical federalism is about how do the states interact with each other. The most important way, or perhaps the most important way, and also perhaps the most misunderstood way in which states interact with each other, is through the full faith and credit clause. The full faith and credit clause requires that states recognize important actions of other states, even if those actions don't exactly match up with their own state's policies. For practical purposes, this basically relates to marriages, divorces, adoptions. As such, if an individual is legally married in one state, they're legally married in all states, even if they got married under a set of circumstances that does not exactly match up with the second state's requirements. What this does not relate to in any way is licenses. Marriage licenses, driver's licenses, concealed carry permits, and so forth are not covered by full faith and credit. So let me try to clear up some confusion, particularly with regard to marriages. A marriage license is permission to get married. Your marriage license is valid in one state only and oftentimes has a time limit on it. So once you are married, you also get what is called a certificate of marriage. That says that you are in effect married. That certificate of marriage is valid in all states. Your driver's license is issued by one state and is valid in one state only. One state cannot authorize you to do anything in a second state. Another state can, of its own free will, recognize your license to operate a car, practice medicine, carry a concealed weapon under a concept called reciprocity. So while full faith and credit is a mandatory requirement set forth in the Constitution, reciprocity is a voluntary process by which one state recognizes what another state has done. Again, full faith and credit is mandatory. States have no choice, and that basically relates to marriages, divorces, adoptions, and civil judgments. Reciprocity is voluntary and often is used in terms of reciprocal recognition of licensing, professional licenses, driver's licenses, concealed carry licenses, but not everything is reciprocal. The Comity Clause, also known as the Privileges and Immunities Clause, requires that states treat you as if you're a state you're visiting treats you as if you're a citizen of that state, even if you're not, with regard to fundamental rights. For example, you're a resident of state A, you're visiting state B. State B cannot have a separate set of rules as to how it treats you. It must treat you as if you are a resident of state B with regard to fundamental rights. Another way in which states interact with each other is through extradition. Extradition is a process by which a person who commits a crime in one state flees to a second state, is brought back to the first state. States are not authorized to exercise law enforcement powers outside of their boundaries, so they have to rely upon other states to help them catch fugitives. Interstate compacts are ways in which states enter into agreements with each other. Most interstate compacts deal with utilization of natural resources or are used to solve common problems. Interstate compacts can be thought of as treaties among states. Interstate compacts are required to be approved by Congress. The last thing is going to be laboratories of democracy, which is a phrase that is used to describe policy experimentation at the state level. States often try policy initiatives and then other states may desire to copy them if they view them as being successful. This is not possible in a unitary system because policy is uniform throughout the political system. However, it is possible in a federation. So we see one state trying something, another state later on adopting it, or maybe a policy is tried at the state level and then adopted at the national level. Federalism makes this possible. Lastly, just some odds and ends that we want to wrap up or talk about before we wrap up federalism. One thing is that federalism provides multiple points of access to policymakers. Citizens can interact with policymakers at both the national level and at the state level. So you don't win or lose at one level. If you lose one place, you can always go to the next place. So the outcome of your policy preferences or your battle for your policy preferences isn't solely decided at one level. You can always fight at the next level. Furthermore, federalism tends to lower the cost of political participation. This is because many decisions are made at a state or, for that matter, local level. Not everything is done at a national level. If the United States was a unitary system, virtually all policy or all major policy would be made at the national level, and that would tend to increase cost of participation. Since policy is made at the state level, citizens are more easy. It's more easy to interact with state level officials. In fact, maybe you go to a church with them, maybe you see them at the shopping mall, whatever. You tend to be more likely to interact with policymakers at a local level or state level than you do at the national level.